The Imagine Austin Speaker Series. The Imagine Austin Speaker Series is at its core an opportunity for us to engage in mutual learning and shared dialogue. So thank you all for everyone coming out on this evening and joining in this very important discussion about a tremendously important and urgent subject that's affecting our city and our community today. Today we're here to hear from University of Texas professors and authors of a year-long study on gentrification as they present their findings around a series of pressing questions. Where is gentrification taking place in our city, and what strategies have been used by other cities and in Austin to mitigate displacement, and what could we do moving forward? The format for tonight is going to be, we're going to hear from our presenters about their work, and then we'll open it up for questions from you all. So please save your questions till the very end, and please write your comments on the surveys that are available on the table at the door. And now I will hand it over to our speakers. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Mueller and Dr. Jake Wegmann.
Thank you. Ooh, it's right in my face there. Whoops. Okay. Not good at the technology. Okay, I think I got it now. So thank you all for coming out this evening. I'm going to be giving you an overview of what we did in this study, and my co-author Jake Wegmann is here. Heather Way was unable to be here due to a family emergency. We had a number of students that also assisted us in this study, and I think I saw one of them come in, Alex Radke, back there, who helped us with a lot of the mapping. The report that we're presenting today is also available on a website. The web address is listed on this slide. You can download the whole thing or pieces of it as you wish from that site. And we're working on the quality because we know that some of it is a little bit fuzzy right now. So before I begin, the first urgent question is, why another study? And I think, everybody feels like we know this is an urgent problem. Why do we need to study this again? And I think our feeling about this was we have had a number of studies that have looked at this. We do have a lot of lists of ideas of what we could do about it. What we don't have is a more focused strategy for thinking about what to do about it. So our goal in this was to respond to the resolution the council passed that asked us to do a study of gentrification, displacement, and mapping of vulnerable neighborhoods to provide the council with the necessary foundation for policy decisions. So for that, we thought we needed to focus the council's attention on where we need to focus our attention. Where is this problem the most severe? What kind of actions are best matched to conditions in those places? And what are the trade-offs to be considered in adopting specific strategies? There are things that we did not look at in this report. We didn't look at related questions like where else in the city can people move to if they're displaced? What are strategies for opening up access to other parts of town? We didn't look at that. The strategic housing blueprint is setting goals for different parts of town and looking at those issues. We also didn't address issues of housing supply, where to put new supply. At the time that we were first asked to do this study, Code Next was still happening, and that was where that discussion was going to take place. So first, what we understand by gentrification. Gentrification refers to a process through which higher income residents move into a neighborhood with historically low property values and many vulnerable residents. Housing costs rise in that area. Vulnerable residents are displaced, and often this happens at a scale that's large enough that it changes the cultural character of the neighborhood. There's a lot of debate about whether or not there are any benefits to rising property values and improvements that come to areas that are considered to be gentrifying. The debates center on who receives those benefits, but there's really widespread agreement that displacement is bad, and that being involuntarily displaced from one's neighborhood is a destabilizing and often devastating experience, especially for those least well-equipped to weather it. So just as background, for thinking about which areas are most vulnerable, there are some trends happening nationally that relate to this. So on the one hand, we have increasing interest in living in the center of cities. And this chart on the left, what it's showing you is the price of housing in the center of cities, and it's showing you how many miles from the center it is. And the top line is 2010, and then the lines go down. So you can see the bottom line from 1980. It was actually cheaper to live within 5 miles of downtown than it was to live in suburbia. And then over time, that's really changed. We've had this inversion in the pattern. So now it's very expensive to live downtown and much cheaper to live farther out. And this is data from across the country in different metropolitan areas. So this is something happening across the country. We have this trend. And then, of course, at the same time, we have a trend in most cities. We have areas of town that have been made less valuable through planning practices, through private real estate practices, through a lot of public actions over time. And those central neighborhoods then become the most vulnerable to these pressures for living downtown. The map on the right-hand side is just one example in this history. For Austin, that's our redlining map from 1937, which shows which areas of town were considered hazardous areas for banks to make mortgage loans to. And it really tracked onto what had happened in the 1928 plan with the creation of the Negro District and deed restrictions and other patterns that had already set up this pattern of making these areas undervalued areas. So when we talk about displacement also, I want to talk about what we mean by that. So there are different kinds of displacement. Direct displacement is when somebody's housing costs rise too high for them, so they can't stay. And that's something like rent increases, property taxes that you can't afford, evictions due to, often evictions here are due to non-payment. So your rent goes up, your rent can go up very quickly in Texas. They don't need to give you a lot of notice. And people are often evicted for non-payment. Essentially, that means they're evicted because they can't afford the new higher rent. Or someone could be forced out because their house is demolished or apartment building is demolished. The conditions can be deemed uninhabitable. So those are examples of direct displacement. Indirect displacement refers to the process where as units become vacant, there's a lot of turnover, especially in rental housing. But if units become vacant and the price goes up, the new people moving in are no longer like the people who moved out. So that's a process of indirect displacement, or sometimes called residential succession, where different groups move in over time, and low-income residents are excluded by rising prices. And then the last thing on here is the hardest thing to kind of quantify and measure, but cultural displacement. And this can happen even if you remain in the neighborhood. Professor Eric Tang at UT has done research in the neighborhood around Houston-Tillotson University, talking to people who have lived there since the late 90s, and found that a lot of longtime residents who are still there no longer feel at home in their neighborhood. They feel this sense of cultural displacement or loss of belonging. So I think here I'm going to turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you. If you'll just bear with me for a minute, I'm going to escape out of PowerPoint, and now I have to move this over. Hey, every now and then technology works, right? If I could just make this a little bigger. Oops.
Yeah, go ahead.
There we go. Frankie is making sure that we're staying on track. Thank you. what I'm going to do here is just walk you through this series of maps that we made, again, with the help of our really brilliant grad students like Alex Radke. This first one is our map of vulnerability. And I should start by mentioning that here we made a few tweaks, but really we used a method that was developed by Dr. Lisa Bates of Portland State University. So she used it in her study in Portland, and then it's been applied to Denver and Minneapolis and perhaps some other places. So this is beginning to become a widely used tool. So in this first map, we're looking at what are the census tracts, and census tracts, you can think of that as like a neighborhood in Austin. What are the census tracts where there are a lot of vulnerable residents living compared to the typical levels in the 5-county Austin metropolitan area? So, and we're defining, you can see them here on the left, how we're defining vulnerability. We're defining with 5 factors. Percentage of people who are renters, the percentage of people of color living in the tract, the percentage of people who are at least 25 years or older who have from a 4-year college degree on up, the percentage of children in poverty, which was a particular interest of some of the city council members, and then finally the percentage of people making less than 80% of the median income for the region. So we know from research and experience that people who are in these different categories face differing levels of vulnerability in the housing market. In other words, if they endure some kind of a shock, like their rent goes up, they lose a job, or they have to take in an elderly relative, they're just less able to deal with those sorts of shocks than others. And so what you're looking at here is just the tracts that we found where these populations are particularly concentrated. So that's vulnerability. Now, vulnerability doesn't necessarily equals gentrification. So some of these tracts are gentrifying, some of them might not have gotten to that point yet. So now if I move to this next tab, this is demographic change. So these are the neighborhoods in Austin where the demographic groups that are associated with gentrification have really just shot up in terms of the share that they make up of each neighborhood. And my colleague, Dr. Mueller, earlier talked about inversion, and you can really see it in this map, right? It kind of looks like a big sort of lopsided bullseye surrounding downtown, where just the neighborhoods, I mean, really to the north, the east, and the south, a little bit to the west, but kind of encircling downtown have just really experienced a dramatic level of change since the year 2000, which is what we're looking at here. Then, if I move on, what are the neighborhoods where the property values reported by people who own their own homes and in census data, what are the places where those have outpaced the increases in the rest of the metro area? And the map here looks pretty similar to the vulnerability map. It's this pattern that's sometimes called the Eastern Crescent, meaning kind of, I think of it as sort of a backward C that starts in North Austin and kind of follows 183 more or less through East Austin and down to South Austin. And then finally, if we put all these different analyses together, according to the method that Dr. Lisa Bates used, then we get this gentrification typology. And that's what we're looking at here. And I hope the colors are visible there. And if you look in this legend here, you see that the neighborhoods that appear in these different colors are grouped according to the stage of gentrification that they're in. So, generally closer to downtown, we have, for example, the purple and dark brown tracts, and those are the ones that are far along in the process. And you all know this from your knowledge of Austin. You've seen the changes. And then, generally speaking, as you kind of move, as you radiate further and further away from downtown, you're in the earlier and earlier stages of gentrification. So, we crunched a lot of data and we got to a map that I think, sort of reflected what we sort of thought was going on. So I guess I'll leave it there and I'll go back to the slides if I can figure out how to do it. And, you know, we can certainly bring up this map later if there are questions. And oh, yeah, right. I actually wanted to go back to the browser. Yeah, one more thing. You know, of course, this is on our website, and you can look at it at your leisure. But just one thing to note is if you click on any of these tracks, then it pops up a name for it, and then just a few facts about it, demographic facts. So just to mention that. Sure. So these relate to this. I'm struggling to make the chart bigger.
There was a thing here where you could touch that and make it bigger. Is that not there?
That doesn't seem to be working, yeah.
Might just describe them.
Yeah, so I'll just kind of run through them really quickly. So the, I guess you could say this teal color right here is, these are the neighborhoods that get classified as susceptible. In other words, we don't see gentrification happening yet, but there is a critical mass of vulnerable people living in them, and furthermore, they are touching another neighborhood that is experiencing gentrification. And we know from research, and I would think, you know, this again will square with a lot of your experiences, gentrification, it doesn't tend to hopscotch. It tends to spread out from areas where it's already happened. And, you know, and of course, it's worth mentioning that all of our data here is lagged behind by a few years. Because here it is, we're in late 2018, and we're using census data that was collected between 2012 and 2016. That's just the latest census data that we can get at the census tract level. So things could be further along than what we're showing here. So that's susceptible. And then next up is early type 1. And those are ones where we're beginning to see the shifts. But examples of that would include Montopolis, for example. Came out as early type 1. Dynamic is sort of right in the middle of the phase. You know, that's where the big changeover is occurring, more or less right now. And then late is, like the name implies, the late stages. And then there's also continued loss, which is these sort of, I guess you could say, teal-colored ones, like this one here, for example, Bolden Creek. And those are areas that have basically gone through the whole cycle of gentrification. They are now pretty high-value neighborhoods, but they tend to still have some vulnerable residents still living in them, maybe because there's some subsidized housing or Section 8 housing or other kinds of mechanisms that keep people there. So it's not as though once a neighborhood has gone all the way through gentrification that the vulnerable populations are just completely gone. So there could still be perhaps things that we should think about safeguarding those communities. So I think I'll turn it back to you if. Oh, for me? Okay. Well, that didn't help. I've tried pressing S5.
No, you're fine.
Thank you. Okay, so, you know, this is what I just showed you. This was the sequence of that series of maps. And then, again, this is just showing what I talked about before, the 5 vulnerability factors for populations who are vulnerable to displacement. And so what did we end up with? Well, out of 200 neighborhoods that we looked at in Austin, 23 of them are in the susceptible phase. So there's a lot of places where some early intervention, because we kind of know what's happening, could be helpful. And then you see, the numbers for the other kinds of neighborhoods in different phases. Now, another thing that we did, and this is another idea that comes out of the Portland State study, is something called a neighborhood drill down. And we only did it, we only had scope to really do it for 2 parts of town. We did it for Montopolis, and then we also did it for St. John's, Coronado Hills, in sort of northeast Austin. And just now, to be clear, this is not a boots on the ground, talking to residents kind of a analysis. That's really important. That's the kind of work that Dr. Eric Tang has done. That's not what we did here. But what it is it's an attempt to use a wider variety of data sources, not just census data, but things like multiple listing service sales data, using building permit data, and school data from the state of Texas, and just a variety of other sources to try to really look in depth. Who are the different vulnerable groups within a given neighborhood, and really try to get granular and nuanced about what might be effective strategies in that neighborhood. But like I said, of course, it needs to be paired with real, meaningful engagement with people who live there. You want to come and talk about case studies?
So just, we're going to have a lot of time at the end for it. Yeah. This light is really hard for me to deal with. I can't see anybody. Whoops. Okay. Yeah, thank you. All right, so just one more comment about the neighborhood drill downs we did. We did that partly to show, like, we've presented this overall pattern that shows which neighborhoods are affected, what stage they're at in this process. But to know better what you would want to do for a neighborhood, you need to understand better who lives there and which groups within that neighborhood are really under the most threat. So that was the point of the drill downs. And, the Montopolis drill down is interesting because Montopolis is a poorer neighborhood with more people of color than the city, but it's similar to the city in the number of homeowners, or the share of residents that are homeowners, or it has been, but that's really changing. So we saw a big decline in homeownership there. And then the other neighborhood we did a drill down in, the St. John's, Coronado Hills area, was a much stronger renter population, more low-income Latino families that were renting. So they would likely need different kinds of things to try and prevent them from being displaced. So that was the idea, was to just sort of show what you could do with other kinds of information to better understand what was happening in that neighborhood. And then, of course, you'd want to pair that with engagement with the community to better understand their perspectives about what's happening and what really matters to them. The other thing we did then, in trying to come up with ideas of things that could be done, we wanted to avoid the kind of laundry list best practice approach. And oftentimes we see this in reports where there's a long list of ideas, but then when we kind of scratch at them a little bit, there really isn't that much information about them. Some of them are ideas, but they haven't really been used. We don't know how they work, and we don't know kind of what context they would work best in. So instead of doing that or focusing on that as our approach, we decided that we would try and find communities that had really been trying to address displacement and see how it worked, do deep case studies of those places so we could better understand what it took, how long it took, the resources, and the different things they did. So in the end, we looked at these 3 neighborhoods that were very different, but taught us, different things about what was important. So the first one was Portland, Oregon, the inner north and northeast neighborhoods, which historically were the home to about 80% of the black community in Portland. It's an area that was very strongly affected by urban renewal, so there'd been a lot of displacement in that period. The community was threatened again with a development that was Trader Joe's was the main tenant in the development, and they really rose up against it and demanded that there be some sort of community process to talk about what was happening in that community. So they had a very community-driven approach where they came up with a plan, they identified the things they thought needed to be done, and the city dedicated a significant amount of money to their plan. It started out being in the tens of millions of dollars, but by the end it was up to $100 million in tax increment finance funds that will be dedicated to these efforts over a 6 or 7 year period in this community. So it's a very significant amount of money. And the thing that we found really interesting about it too was the amount of community, the role of the community in defining what needed to happen and in oversight of it. So they have this oversight committee that is community members, and they are following it. This is the youngest of the 3 cases. It's only been going for 5 or 6 years. So there are some things that aren't working as intended, and that oversight committee is really hammering on that and trying to get the city to readjust to deal with those things. So that was the first one we looked at. The second one was Washington, D.C., the Columbia Heights neighborhood. And Columbia Heights is a historically African-American neighborhood that has changed a lot over the years, but most recently was threatened when they opened a new subway stop there. They put in the first urban Target and this big sort of redevelopment around that subway stop. So there was a lot of pressure on the area to change. But that neighborhood had been successful at preserving over 20% of the housing in the neighborhood as permanently affordable. And in this case, it was less driven by a community plan and more a reflection of the citywide policy tools they had in place that really protect renters. And a lot of this really dates back to the period when they first got home rule power. Prior to home rule in D.C., a congressional committee actually governed the District of Columbia. So once they got home rule powers and they mostly had civil rights leadership as mayor and council, they passed a number of laws that gave tenants the right to purchase rental housing when it was up for sale. And they also added a lot of things that made that a reality. So they had a lot of money backing technical assistance, tenant organizing, and other things so that when a building is put up for sale, they have enough notice. A tenant association can work with people that can help them put together the financing, and they can actually purchase their buildings and live in them as limited equity co-ops. So that was very interesting to us. They have in the city government an office of the tenant advocate. It has $4 million budget annually. They have an affordable housing preservation officer, and they have this network of people that focus on preservation of affordable housing who work on these issues from tenant advocacy perspective, affordable housing, city departments, so there are people watching buildings whose subsidies are expiring, other people who know which buildings are in really poor condition and are in danger because of that. And so that group has really pushed and made sure that they don't lose things that are threatened. The city also has a housing trust fund that they put $100 million a year into. So that's just kind of mind-blowing for us. They are able to do that partly because they have some sort of real estate fee that they can use, and it's something that unfortunately we in Texas are not allowed to use. But there is significant political will as far as funding there. And then the third case we looked at was Austin's Guadalupe neighborhood. Many of you probably know the origins of that story, but the Guadalupe neighborhood in the late 80s was threatened by a proposal to greatly expand the French legation and make that into more of a sort of tourist attraction in the neighborhood. It would have taken out a bunch of homes surrounding that area. And the irony was this project was going to be funded by community development block grants, which the neighborhood qualified for because it was a low-income community. So it was supposed to be revitalization, but it was a big threat to the neighborhood. So the neighborhood organized, they convinced the city council to redirect that money to their organization, Guadalupe Neighborhood Development Corporation. They created a plan for their community, and they began working on preservation. At the point when they started, there were probably, it's a very small neighborhood, there were probably less than 200 homes in it, but they have preserved more than 90 of them. There's been a lot of other housing added to that neighborhood over time, but they've been very successful in preventing the complete, erasure of that community. And they're also an interesting case because they're in Austin, they're having to deal with our challenges being in Texas, the politics of Austin. They are very close to downtown. They've had to deal with the fact that the price of land has risen. When they began their work, they strategically bought lots, and they did it throughout the neighborhood so that it would be very hard for somebody to assemble a lot of lots and do a giant project, because there was always something they owned that would be in the way of doing that. That was feasible when lots were $5,000. Now they're hundreds of thousands of dollars. So they no longer can afford to buy lots in the neighborhood, so they've begun doing different forms of infill on the lots they own. So they've done affordable accessory dwelling units. They did a small rental complex. They're going to do more of that. They did the first community land trust home ownership units. They've had to be very creative in figuring out what to do given how expensive property got in that area. So looking at those cases, and there's actually on the website, in the report itself, which is already pretty long, we realize we just have a 2-page overview of each case, but we have a whole separate document that has the fuller version of the cases if you want to read more about them. But going through those and thinking about them, a number of themes stood out to us. So the first was that it is just incredibly important that the community has a meaningful role in the process. The community has to be defining what the things are that should be prioritized for that neighborhood. So we can help with data and other things, but there really has to be that community engagement. And that means for that to happen, we have to think about are there strong community organizations in those areas now? If not, how do we help, build them? What kind of capacity can we help the neighborhood build so that they can play that role? How will the neighborhood be able to kind of monitor what's happening over time? How do we make sure that happens? So there's a lot of things to think through to make that work, and there's a wide range of conditions across the neighborhoods that are affected right now. Another thing is it takes a really long time. So the DC example, they've been working on these things since the late 70s. The Guadalupe neighborhood's been working on this since the late 80s, but they've been working on it consistently and building on it over time, and they had a kind of a strategy that they were working toward. But it takes that, and it takes having a committed organization or people that are going to keep on it over time. So that's just a reality of the places we saw that were having an impact. The other thing is it really matters to act early. So in the Guadalupe case, the fact that they did buy those lots early on gave them a lot of power because it prevented certain types of wholesale redevelopment from happening. It meant they had land they could try and do something with. That's much easier to do when you're in that early stage, when you're a neighborhood we called susceptible, or in that early stage where land prices haven't yet gone up a lot. So, so thinking about strategically buying land in those neighborhoods, either the city owning it or the nonprofit owning it, is really critical. But that also means thinking about what the city is doing that might have an effect on the neighborhood and making sure that anti-displacement strategies are part of that or are considered things that have to happen early on. So, in a lot of what we're doing in planning, we're trying to increase density near transit. We have centers, these different kinds of centers in Imagine Austin that we want to channel growth to. So if you look at this map and you think about the neighborhoods that are susceptible, they're near something that's going to happen, or a neighborhood that's already changing. And this morning I spoke to city staff, and one of the things I said is whatever department you're in, you should think about your projects and look at where they are. Are they in these areas? Like, what effect might you have on housing prices in that neighborhood by the work you're doing? and what could be done to try and prevent displacement that might come from that. You know, how do we try and get ahead of this, and how can we get the city to see that as just something they automatically should be doing when they're doing large infrastructure work. Then it requires a lot of money. You know, there's just no way around that. The places that are trying to do something at a scale that will keep enough of a community there so people feel at home or have the possibility of feeling at home is going to require a lot of money. There just isn't any way around that. And that's politically difficult because, you know, we have to think about, like, we have this map of these neighborhoods. Well, where do we start? Which neighborhoods do we work in? You know, how are we going to prioritize, and how are we going to bring enough funding to these places over time to have an impact? And then the last point was matching strategies to local conditions. So, you know, in Washington, D.C., they have a lot of multifamily rental housing in that neighborhood. The strategy of helping people buy those buildings made a lot of sense there. You know, each neighborhood is going to have a different set of problems and different kinds of housing and other things, and whatever is going to happen is going to have to be matched to that. So, you know, it has a possibility of being effective at a big enough scale. And the picture there is actually a building that the tenants purchased in Washington, exercising their rights under the city's Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. So after we'd gone through this process and we had tried to learn what we could about what had worked in other places, what kind of strategies they had used, we tried to think about how could we organize information about what could be done in a way that would help the city council or help other people in the city think about being strategic. So the first thing was establishing what a vision and goals would be for this from past public discussions. There have been many task force and other reports over the years, so we went back and looked at all of those, and there are ones happening right now. Then we wanted also to identify, you know, we pulled a set of goals out from those discussions that I'll tell you in a minute what those are. Then we organized potential solutions under each of those goals. So if you are looking at a neighborhood and the issue is really displacement of renters, what are the different things that are focused on preventing displacement of renters that we might try? And then the other thing was how to think about the trade-offs involved in picking different approaches. So we developed a set of criteria that I'll describe in a minute to help encourage council to think about the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches. So first, the vision statement that we came up with from looking through these past reports has several parts. First, low-income residents and persons of color and their children in historically disadvantaged communities have the opportunity to stay and return to their neighborhoods in the face of rising property values and an influx of more affluent residents. Then another part of the vision, over time, opportunities remain for new low-income residents to live in the community, you know, or the city will eventually lose them entirely. And then residents have a meaningful role in shaping the future of their neighborhoods. So these were all things that we saw in the many processes that have already happened that seem part of a vision. But, you know, this is very ambitious. How do we do all of this? How do we make progress? You know, how do we focus? This is very broad. So then we also identified 6 different goals that came out of many past reports and efforts. We want to prevent displacement of renters. We want to prevent displacement of homeowners, and I'm talking about low-income renters and low-income homeowners. We want to retain existing affordable housing. We want to plan inclusively to prevent displacement. We want to enable the return of those who have been displaced. And we want to create new housing for current and future residents. So these are all goals that we saw in past work. And so we then organized a lot of the ideas that we found in our case studies and from reviewing other examples under these goals. So this is maybe kind of hard to see, but this is just a page out of the report showing you kind of an example, that at the top we have this one, the first goal, prevent vulnerable renters in gentrifying neighborhoods are not displaced from their current homes and neighborhoods. So this is about not displacing renters. And an example of one of the strategies would be increasing city legal protections for renters to reduce evictions and other forms of displacement. And one of the ideas there would be mandatory city tenant protections for all rental properties that get city funds right now. You know, we give different kinds of funds to lots of different properties. We could say, if you have these funds, you must abide by these protections for tenants. So, you know, for each of those 6 goals, we did this. We have kind of sub-strategies. We identified lots of ideas. For each of those ideas, we have a brief description of it. We have a short statement of pros and cons. We have an example of a place that's using this tool now. So this is meant to be helpful if we've identified a neighborhood, we're trying to understand what the needs are there, and we think we need to be focused on renters, then we have a set of things we can think about that would help renters. I'm going to let Jake talk about the funding issues.
And so, you know, just really briefly, like she mentioned earlier, emerging from the case studies, this does take a lot of money. So there's the question of, well, where does the money come from? And, you know, affordable housing finance, it's so complicated, it's such an alphabet soup, but really it really kind of boils down to 4 major strategies. So one of them is just devoting money from the city budget, from general revenue towards affordable housing. We could do that. We don't do a ton of that. It's hard, right? Because just every budget cycle, every year, there are a lot of competing priorities, and the politics are difficult, frankly. Secondly, there's something called tax increment financing, which is a way of capturing some of the increased value that you get from new development within a particular part of the city, and then redirecting some of that uplift in property taxes towards affordable housing. I mean, we use this in Austin, but we really don't use it for affordable housing. Other cities, including Dallas, do use it for affordable housing, so that is maybe something we should look at. General obligation bonds, as I'm sure most of you know, this in just a few weeks we'll be voting on a $250 million affordable housing bond. And that would really put Austin into the big leagues. Portland has passed a bond for affordable housing of about that size. Our previous biggest one was $65 million. So we'd really be upping our game in terms of a real commitment. Now, the downside, of course, is it requires a vote, which subjects it to scrutiny that other kinds of spending don't get. The good part is once you've issued the bonds, then basically that's the city committing for a period of years to fund. It's making affordable housing a priority. And then finally, this is a bit of a mouthful, but we have this already, density bonus in lieu fees. And this is a case where in some parts of the city right now, if a developer wants to build more than they can under the standard zoning, then they can choose to build a bigger building, but only if they either provide affordable housing on site or pay into a fund, and those fees are called in lieu fees. And right now, the city of Austin is looking at all these density bonus areas, and there's potential for capturing more money from those which could go towards affordable housing.
So the next thing we did was try and think about what criteria would we use to try and think through the pros and cons of different things that we might choose. So first we wanted to think about which group will this help? Is this a strategy or a tool that is focused on helping renters, homeowners? You know, which group is it supposed to help? What stage of gentrification would it best fit? Most things are going to be easier to do in the early stages, but there are some things that can work later on. Is this strategy place-based? So as I mentioned in the DC case, there were a lot of things they did that were citywide policies that ended up really supporting tenants. And that's certainly really important and something that we, I think, also need to think about as a long-term, kind of the long game that goes along with this. But if we're going to try and do something that affects a particular neighborhood, we also need to think about, are these things that we're picking things that we can really dedicate to a particular place. Another issue is the present versus the future issue. Is this particular approach going to help mostly current residents? Can it also help future residents? Which group will it affect the most? How will the voices of vulnerable residents be represented? So some strategies, if you're talking about a community planning approach, obviously that involves the community voices. But we put a lot of things in here that are things people are talking about, whether or not we agreed with all of them, just so that they would be there for the pros and cons to be considered. So there might be like some sort of private investment fund in affordable housing. Well, that's not something that typically, vulnerable residents have a voice in. Then the next, it's like hard to see these things. How much funding is required? So we wanted to think about, although we couldn't come up with like specific numbers that a particular thing would cost, we could still think about, is this something that requires a big upfront investment? Does it require then a lot of ongoing funding? Or is it something that's more of a policy change that doesn't require as much funding? So we tried to kind of score things on that as well. And then the last one, I don't know why this doesn't want to show up. Do we have the current capacity to do it? The staff really like this criteria. Because, what if we say, oh, this is a great idea, and maybe we have some staff that have these skills, but they don't have the time to do this. Do we need to hire more people to do this? Does this particular approach envision the community having a really strong role, like having this oversight role or running a planning process? Do they have the capacity to do it? Would we need to provide resources to them? So that's another really important thing to think about as we go through different ideas. So in the report, we took about 9 ideas drawn out of the earlier list that we had grouped under those different goals, and we tried to kind of run through each of them and think about each of these things. And this is just a chart that's showing kind of how they came out. But we put that in there to try and kind of jumpstart a more thoughtful conversation about what the trade-offs are in picking some things and not picking other things. So we've been talking for a long time. I know this is a lot of information, so I don't know if I'll talk through all of these, but these were some of the ideas that came up in what we were looking at that we thought were interesting. The first one, the Homestead Preservation Center, the idea is we found in some of our drill downs, there still were quite a lot of people, and we found in research with the county that there are a fair number of households that still don't have their homestead exemptions. That there could be a lot of outreach from a community, a neighborhood preservation center, and I know Poder did this in the past, to go out and try and make sure everybody knows about those things and everyone is signed up for them. And there could be a lot of other outreach that could be done at the same time related to home repair, other things. So that was one idea that we found that other places had done too. The preservation network, that was the idea that came out of Washington that I described earlier. So they were like really ahead of things, so they're much less likely to lose existing housing that's affordable to people. The DC program that allows tenants the opportunity to buy their building, with all the supports for that, was something else we thought was important. The land banking idea. The below market debt fund, there's a lot of different discussions about funds that could be created, and we looked at several of those ideas in the report, and my feeling is the ones that are all private money are not really very helpful for the anti-displacement issue because they're not really going to be reaching people at low enough income levels. You need to put more public money into it. Denver has a fund that they use to try and buy land and preserve affordable housing near transit that's been pretty successful. And then the last one on the list was this community-driven neighborhood scale planning efforts. So those are just some of the highlights of things that we found through our research. So I'll wrap it up so people can ask questions. So we were trying to, in this report, identify neighborhoods and groups of residents most vulnerable to displacement as costs rise, and also those same groups are also groups that would face difficulty finding housing once displaced. That map, by the way, we also have a whole methodology that we're handing off to the city, so they'll be able to update those maps and continue to look at, are other areas becoming susceptible, what's happening over time. Then we were trying to identify strategies and policies for preventing their displacement and provide a kind of framework to help the city council, people in the community think about how do we put together anti-displacement strategies that will work in Austin. So that's it. Sorry for going on so long.
We'll now be taking approximately 30 minutes of questions. The opportunity is for one question per person, because there's quite a few people. There's almost 85 people here. And I'll be taking this side, and Sam will be taking this side, and we'll be spreading the love. We'll go to you first.
Hello, I'm Angela Benavides Garza, native all my life in East Austin, and thank you for the information. We appreciate that. We've come up with our own solutions as well that we've come up with between a lot of us here. And we understand, I love your ideas that you have here, but here's my question. How do you feel about our voices being at the table so that we combine those solutions with you?
I think that's an excellent idea. And I think that neighborhood housing has been kind of told that they need to look at the ideas in here, the ideas in the People's Plan, which is, I think you're referring to the People's Plan?
That's just one of them, but there's other additional
another
plans
one?
that
Oh.
we're starting to create as well.
Oh, okay.
I've been working on one for 6 years, so.
Okay. Yeah, well, yeah, I think that's completely consistent with what I was saying. It would make no sense for the city to be kind of imposing a strategy on a community.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Jane Rivera. I'm an almost 40-year East Austin native. And I wanted to ask, in your opinion, why do you think it is that Austin's density bonus program has failed to provide housing affordable to vulnerable families?
That's a great question. I think the big answer is because it's a voluntary density bonus, and so we have to incentivize the developers to participate in it, and it never is enough to make the housing very affordable. So what we need to do there is if somebody participates in that program, we should say you are required to accept vouchers for those units. Maybe the city needs to create local vouchers that could be paired with that, because right now, you're right, it's providing units that are not really getting at the need. We have other issues with it as well, that it's often providing very small units. We need to rethink how that works so that we're providing units that are better meeting what the needs are. But I think because we're not allowed to mandate it, we are stuck with this kind of having to incentivize developers to do it, and it doesn't get us enough. So we have to figure out what else could be brought to make sure it's going to really meet the need.
Hi, Sarah, also an Austin native, a lot of us tonight, I think. I had wondered if you had considered the intersection between health, employment, education with housing, because I know a lot of the susceptible neighborhoods that you were sort of showing on the map were in suburban areas, and I know that my professor, Ann Forsythe, has talked about the health costs, and I know Chetty has done work on suburbanization of poverty, and so how do you make sure you're not just saving affordable housing in communities that might need other support, transportation, their transportation costs, things like that?
That's another great question. So I think that, again, is why you want to have the community involved in developing the plan, because you don't just want to have to save housing in an area, but not address the other conditions that are problematic in that area. In some cases, if it's a gentrifying area, there may be a lot of changes coming that are considered kind of improvements in quality of life, but you also want to make sure that whatever those changes are things that benefit the longtime residents as well. And Professor Tang's research kind of suggested that the long-term residents didn't feel that the changes coming to their neighborhood were for them at all.
I'm Monica Guzman, native Austinite. I live, work, and volunteer in the Eastern Crescent and have for many years. My question is, how did you select the Montopolis and St. John Coronado areas for the drill down?
We we looked at neighborhoods that were in the earlier phases because we thought it might be more productive to, I guess you could say, shine a spotlight on areas where policy attention now could make a bigger difference. And there, particularly Montopolis, there are other efforts swirling around that right now that we thought by providing a drill down, we could provide some information that may be useful there. But really, ideally, we would just love it if drill downs were done for all the vulnerable neighborhoods in Austin, but we just, of course, did those too.
Hi, my name is Mattson. I'm interested in creative placemaking and really just mobilizing more artists who are already inclined to help their neighbors and their community with cultural and community development. So I'm a bit new to this, and I'm curious to know how I could work more with the city and other organizations in mobilizing artists who are already, as creative placemakers, already helping in community and cultural development plans.
That's an important set of constituencies. I guess we didn't specifically address that in our report.
Yeah, I'm not really sure how to answer that. Yeah, I mean, creative placemaking can mean a lot of different things. One of the issues that came up this morning in the question and answer was about the sense of cultural displacement and the lack of interaction between old and new residents. Maybe there's something in the arts that can help with that, but I'm not really sure. I don't want to speak for communities in terms of how that would work out, but I think it's a good idea to propose that as a tool, as a potential idea for fostering more interaction, maybe.
If I could just mention just something I learned about a couple weeks ago, but a young man, an architect from Seattle, I don't remember his name, but he is behind an effort called Africa Town in the Central District in Seattle, which is doing, I think, a lot of using placemaking in a culturally relevant way for the existing community that's under tremendous displacement pressure. So I think that's a model to look at.
Stu from District 2, where 52% of us are homeowners, but our median income is $30,000 below the city average. I've identified 8 major problems with your report that I'd like to hand to you and not get you to respond tonight. But I want to suggest that we wrote gentrification reports here in 2000, 2001, 2002, and 2003. Many of the solutions you offered, we offered, and they never got implemented. Some of us never give up, but I'm incredibly skeptical about, A, whether these things can be done in Texas, because I think many of them can't, and B, if you tried to do them, then the legislature would do what it did with source of income and linkage fees and prohibit you from doing them. So we always have to remember that 11th in Congress drives our policies, and try and come up with some strategies that we could actually implement, not just talk about.
Well, it's Heather Way, who's the lead author on the report and who couldn't make it tonight, but she is very well versed in the state policy context. So there's a section in the report, I'm trying to remember, is it an appendix?
No, it's in the report.
It's in the main body of the report that specifically addresses some of the state limitations on
Yeah.
tools.
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly things, we know the things that are off the table now, and it is certainly true that, we know if we propose bold things, they're gonna try and undo them, but elections matter, I mean, we can't completely constrain ourselves by that, or we'll do nothing, It is challenging, and we have to think carefully about how we go about it. I mean, I think that means mostly we have to think about the land development community and anything we do that's going to impinge upon them, because that's when the legislature will fight back. But, that's the state we live in. I don't know. We have to keep putting those ideas out there and working towards
Well,
them.
it's also worth mentioning that this is not just an Austin problem in Texas
Yeah.
at this point. All the big cities in Texas are going through some version of this process. It might not look exactly the same in Dallas or San Antonio as it does here, but eventually, one would hope enough big city representatives could band together and change the political dynamic.
I mean, it is part of the reality, but, I think we just have to keep putting the ideas out there, and we have to keep pushing.
Hi. I haven't read the report. But I've just heard what I heard tonight, but I never heard anything come up about property taxes. And I'm wondering if your report identifies any ways of alleviating property tax burdens for someone who's paid off a mortgage but is being displaced because they can't pay the taxes on a house that they've already paid for.
Yeah. There are some ideas in the report for that. It is a huge challenge in our state because we're so dependent on property taxes. I mean, you think about California, they have such dramatically higher home values, but they're not being driven out by their property taxes because there's a cap on them. They have an income tax, which we don't have, So we have kind of structural problem with the way the state finances things. But we do identify some tools in there that also could be part of what a Homestead Preservation Center did to try and make people more aware of what are the options for tax deferral and other things, that people might be able to use. And the city could also, part of the challenge is under state law, we're not allowed to offer tax exemptions based on income. So that's a huge constraint. That makes it much harder. It's another huge problem. But there are some things in the report about things that we could do, mostly to make sure that all the tools we have now, people are using them and that people are widely aware of them.
Hi, I'm wondering what role you see transportation playing in gentrification. You mentioned when a transit stop went in, it accelerated gentrification. So I was wondering, how do we promote better mobility and also try to preserve these neighborhoods?
Aren't we out of time yet? It's like questions are getting harder and harder. That is like the conundrum with so much of this, because we want these better things for our neighborhood. We want to have better transit service. We want to have better drainage so we don't have flooding. We want all these things. And then when those things come to the neighborhood, they are part of what increases the property value. I think one thing that we emphasized was just as those kind of improvements are going in, that we should be thinking about the fact that they are going to have an effect and trying to say, well, if we're making an investment of X amount in infrastructure, then that automatically should trigger a certain investment in housing, in the particular housing things that are needed for that community, to try and, kind of not make that automatically a bad thing for that area. But it is a big challenge. And again, it goes back to that property tax problem. If we weren't so dependent on property taxes and we had, an income tax or other ways to, so that people would not bear such a burden or fear their property value increase so much, that would help. But, you know, that's the conundrum we're in.
You asked what group we should help first. Well, of course, it should be the longtime residents that have been displaced. It was their parents, grandparents, et cetera, who served and built this great city, all the while experiencing discrimination and racism. And it's really upsetting that these surveys never mention the racism of Mexican and Mexican Americans. Is that the word cultural seems to be a euphemism for Mexican. You know, I grew up half a block from here, and it's totally 100% gentrified. My family's been here since before this was the United States, so it's really upsetting that y'all never mention, I know this is not a sociological survey, but you never mention the racism of Mexican Americans.
It's true, we didn't spend a lot of time on the history. I mean, I did show that one slide in the beginning that where I briefly talked about how these central neighborhoods were basically devalued through lots of planning things that were rooted in racism, and that's why they're so vulnerable now, as there's more demand for living in the center. You're absolutely right. What? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll cover that real quick. He's saying that the School of Architect and Planning plays a big role in a lot of the policies that have come down that have helped displace us. And that was my whole question. I think that the thing, I'm Susana Almanza with Poder, is that the whole thing that I think that is missing is the policies, because the zoning policies are the one who have been leading the gentrification. I think you all did the report when the East Cesar Chavez plan was adopted. Within 4 years, we saw a 400% increase of land value and 123% of property taxes. And I might add, too, that it was Councilman Renteria who opened that door to displacement and gentrification. They led that fight, and we fought against it. That's where we're at. But I think that we need to look at the policies, because really, take, for instance, the East Riverside Corridor Master Plan that comes through Montopolis, and that's the detrimental. It has brought over 1,000 high-rise condos and apartments and townhomes into a community that has a median family income of $28,000. That's my community. Yeah. So what we need to do is look at the metrics. That Riverside Corridor was built or proposed because it was supposed to bring high transit rail. Okay, that didn't happen. So it never did meet its goal, but yet it's still high building, and it's about to displace 1,000 students from the ballpark. Yeah. So my whole thing is, I think we need to really go, I mean, you kind of talk about there, you look at the policies of preventing, but I think that we need to look at the policies and look at it through the equity lens, and they need to be applied through the housing blueprint, to your anti-displacement report. So they need to be compared and then reviewed and brought back, because those policies are the policies starting for the Cesar Chavez and the Riverside Corridor that are really the ones that are leading the displacement. As most scholars said, what is a main tool for displacement is zoning. And the city has continued to use zoning to displace people of color, low income, the poor. I look at it as it's our homeland. We were, for people who don't know, young people who are here and people who moved to East Austin or not from Austin, is the 1928 master plan forced relocation of people of color to East Austin. We bought our homes from $2,000 to $8,000. They're now valued $250,000 and above. And now the city wants to take the land. So to me, how do you have an indigenous culture that is losing its homeland, and how do we make sure that those cultures remain? And I think that that's what the report is trying to at least lay the thing, is like, how do you, city, here's more proof that what you're doing with your policies is driving people of color, low income, out of East Austin, where you forced them to be, and now you want their land.
Yeah, we, you know, as I mentioned before, we didn't really take on the whole kind of land development code topic, because there was an effort, you know, dealing with that. Obviously, it's a huge issue. In the strategic housing blueprint, they are using, they're using our map, they're using other things that I've produced over time that are about kind of predicting the displacement that'll be caused by these transit-oriented development. Corridor plans, kind of beginning with East Riverside, where I did some research a number of years ago and tried to kind of intervene in that process. So yeah, those things are absolutely critical. And I think the strategic housing blueprint, which is setting these goals for neighborhoods that have never allowed affordable housing, and they're going to have to figure out how that's going to be allowed, how there's going to be access to new parts of town, that's a piece of this. The land development code discussion, like how are we going to consider the existing conditions and current context of these neighborhoods in that process, that's a piece of it. And then, we're trying to contribute, if you've identified these areas that are already kind of experiencing this, what are the things you can be doing? But I think all of those are part of what we need to be doing. So, I don't think, we don't intend for this to be seen as, this is the standalone thing. Those other parts have to happen as well.
I think that one power the city has is the power of controlling the use of land.
Mm-hmm.
And the legislature doesn't usually interfere with that. And so one thing to really stem displacement is controlling the entitlements on a piece of land. Mm-hmm. Most of the low-income and middle-income housing that's destroyed in the urban area is destroyed for greater entitlements. But there's never any talk about controlling entitlements.
Well, that's the whole zoning and land use discussion.
Right.
That's what it's about.
But
Yeah.
I didn't see anything on your thing about controlling entitlements in areas that are vulnerable.
Yeah, well, we do have a couple of strategies in there that are drawn from other cities that have tried things like a neighborhood stabilization overlay, where they kind of limit the size of development in a certain area. Dallas has done that in a low-income neighborhood. We looked at a few things like that, but again, we thought that whole code conversation was, a year ago, that we thought that was where that was going to be discussed. And now, that's not happening. So, so that's part of why we didn't take it on whole hog.
I hope I'm not just asking for myself, but I've only lived in Austin for 10 years, and all of these ideas seem like they're very big and systemic change. What do I do as an individual who is not an Austin native to exacerbate the situation, beyond voting and advocacy? What are the small micro moves that myself or my compatriots can also engage in to help be, even if it's just a small piece that doesn't make the problem worse?
Your turn.
Donate some money if you are able to some of the great community-based organizations that are building affordable housing and gentrifying neighborhoods. I guess I'll be accused of favoritism if I start rattling them off, so maybe I shouldn't. But what you said about voting, but not just voting, also just discussing this issue with people that raising its profile, because honestly, affordable housing, everyone cares about it intensely, but somehow when push comes to shove, it's down the list of priorities. Other things sort of muscle it aside. And so I think anything that can be done to raise the profile of this issue, I think is helpful. I know it's a vague answer, but.
I'm very ignorant of many things that you've already shared. One question I'm curious about is if you could describe the role and impact of Austin's nonprofit affordable housing advocates, like I think of Foundation Communities or Habitat for Humanity, how our work as a city has measured up to other places you've profiled and ways that we can utilize those further.
Can I take a stab at that? Well, I think the organizations that we have Greg Anderson from Habitat for Humanity here. I think he's still here. There he is. We have awesome organizations that do amazing work. Foundation Communities is an incredibly effective nonprofit developer. They operate at scale. They get thousands of units of housing done. we have Guadalupe Neighborhood Development Corporation, which was the driving force behind the Guadalupe neighborhood case study that she was talking about earlier. The trouble is, we just so there I go. I am listing them off. Yeah, Blackland, CDC, you know, lots of a number of groups, but other cities in the U.S. just have more of them, and I think we've hit a ceiling in terms of how big these groups can get and how much work they can do. So San Francisco has numerous organizations that are of the scope of foundation communities. And so I think we have to figure out ways that we can grow these organizations, develop new organizations so they can basically do more.
I just would add to that, in addition to groups that produce affordable housing, some of them neighborhood-based, some of them citywide, we just also have a lot fewer, like we now have BASTA, which I think is doing really great work, tenant organizing and tenant advocacy, but we just don't have the same kind of infrastructure of organizations speaking up for low-income renters or for these communities that a lot of other cities have. And I don't know, part of it may be that we don't put the money into them as a city. You know, like the city of Washington, D.C. funds tenant organizing. They fund tenant organizations. They support tenant rights with money. And some of the other cities have much larger kind of philanthropic communities that also support these organizations than we have here. So we are different in some ways. We are kind of weaker in some ways. What? Did they? Yeah. Yeah, that's right, yeah. And that was really important to them establishing themselves and having a base to work from.
Hi, I'm David Santos, and I wanted to thank the study team, but I wanted to complain about your professions of architecture and planning. Yeah, your professions based out of the UT School of Architecture and the City of Austin Planning Department, who have always failed us. And I appreciate what you're doing, but you need to tell your colleagues to do something different. And we need to call out those planners and architects that are gentrifying our neighborhoods. Austin is lost. Our neighborhood, I'm from here, this neighborhood, and it's a failure case. And so is Northeast Portland, that I'm aware, that I've been there. They're not really models. We need to create a new model and do something different. And I don't think that materialist fatalism, that money is the key. The Paris Commune did not happen on money. Money is what killed the Paris Commune. They gentrified the Paris Commune. And I think we've always thought that schools are the key. We need to teach the world what we did wrong in Austin. Because this Waller Creek neighborhood is completely lost already. And we fell for urban renewal, and then we fell for that master plan, and all of that came from the professional planners and architects. And again, thank you for trying.
Yeah, we're told by the city and some of the people of some of the organizations that you mentioned a minute ago that are building housing, that density equates to affordability. And I think most of us here have seen that density does not equate to affordability. And I can give you an example. My name is Rivera. I'm 70 years old. I'm retired. I live on a fixed income. I've lived in East Austin all my life. I bought my house right here in central East Austin, maybe 4 blocks from Interstate 35 in 1983 for $39,000, 3-bedroom, 2-bath, what is now called a bungalow. And in 2000, my house was worth $70,000. In 2018, my house is worth close to $500,000. And that has to do a lot with the incredible gentrification and lies that are being told about density being equating to affordability. With every apartment complex that goes up on 7th Street, on 6th Street, and it's going up in East Austin, my house my property values are going up, my taxes are out of this world. My question is, how can we, as citizens of Austin, I guess a better question is, you all did the research in other cities, did you see that density equated to affordability?
You know, that isn't what we didn't study that. I mean, the issue, we are a growing city, obviously. We do need to build more housing. I think the issue is, you know, where do we build it? Who will be able to live in different places? We definitely need to add more housing, and there's a lot of trade-offs with thinking about where it's added and what the effect is. But, you know, part of what we showed you initially was there's a lot of demand for living in the center now. And the areas that are hard hit by gentrification pressure, that's because they were undervalued, you know, through past planning and all these things. So they're now experiencing the kind of dramatic rise that you talked about. I think part of what's happening now is, you know, we're going to grow and we have to add housing somewhere. We're going to create new places that are those undervalued places. And what's happening now is they're being created on the edge, like especially to the east. You know, so we have this conundrum. We want new people to be able to move into these neighborhoods that are also low income. You know, Guadalupe's solution was they add some density on the land they own, you know, modest amounts. You know, but we always have this kind of tension there. You know, we have to grow somehow, but the issue is like, what is the consequence of where we put the housing, and how do we think about that in a way that sort of balances those different issues out? I don't have you know, the answer of how to do that without
This is
causing
going to be our
problems.
final question. I want to remind everybody, after this event, please hand in your surveys and tell us what you thought of the speakers and this topic. Here's our last question.
My name's Donna Hoffman. I'm with Blackshear Bridge. We're a community-based group in the neighborhood where Eric Tang did his studies, and that's the heart of Austin's Black Cultural Heritage District, a federally designated area. And it's going to be hard to go back and tell Nell Peterson tomorrow that it's too late, because that was the color of our neighborhood in the study. That being said, and I don't think it is too late. I think there's a lot we can do, and I know there's a lot that we are doing. I want to thank you for this study. I think it's a very useful study. It's going to give me some stuff to work with. I'm very also thankful to the people in this room who are the Eastern Crescent Right to Stay Coalition, who developed the People's Plan and took it and the City Council passed a resolution, and the people in this room are going to the departments of the city and working on implementing those. One of them is Susana Almanza, who's running for City Council. I support you. And I'm inspired by all of you as well and getting good ideas from you. So my question about the study is this. I need to go back and read it more closely. But from your presentation and from my scanning of the study earlier today, I got the impression that the study makes a recommendation of where efforts should be concentrated. And I wanted to ask you what your study says about where efforts should be concentrated. If it's the two areas that you mentioned on the kind of the northern part of the Eastern Crescent and then another neighborhood in the south, I can see where areas of larger need, like larger populations of larger concentrations of need, certainly need more
We didn't
help.
intend for those two areas to be, we weren't suggesting those be prioritized. We were just using them as examples of how you would dig deeper into what was happening in particular neighborhoods to better understand what the needs are and base a local plan with, in part on that information. Yeah, we weren't intending to say those two should be the starting point. So I think that's any last words?
Well, let's give a hand to our two wonderful speakers, Dr. Wegmann and Dr. Mueller from the University of Texas. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming, and please again submit your surveys, which take about a minute, at the sign-in table. Thank you very much for coming.
I got a